From 1995 to 2002, there was a company called WorldCom. They provided telecommunication services along the same lines as Sprint or AT&T. This was a large company. In 2002, they were the second largest long-distance provider and controlled about half of all internet traffic. Michael Jordan, starting in 1995, was their spokesperson.
As our new spokesman, Michael will deliver the LDDS WorldCom message.
Well, in 2002, they had $41 billion in debt and filed for bankruptcy. Their $107 billion in assets made this the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States at the time. This also happens to be one of the largest accounting scandals in the history of the United States. From 1999 until their end in 2002, their earnings figures were a lie. They were using accounting tricks to make the company appear that it was doing better than it actually was, which is terrible. It essentially meant that they were lying to people to get them to invest in their company, to buy their stock. They were investing under false figures that were promised to be true. People tend to be more familiar with Enron. Well, think of this as being right there with it, even bigger by some measures. There were both accounting scandals occurring and exposed at similar times, involving the same auditing firm, Arthur Andersen. I made a video talking about the specifics of the Enron scandal, and now I'm here to give a simple overview of what went on over at WorldCom. In 1983, AT&T was broken up. They practically controlled that entire industry going back to the invention of the telephone, and now that they were being disassembled, it allowed new competition to enter the market. One of these new competitors was a long-distance provider called Long Distance Discount Services, who in 1995 changed their name to WorldCom, and to make things easier, that's what I'll be calling them. Starting in the mid-80s, WorldCom's strategy was to grow through the acquisition of other companies. In 1986, they had revenue of $8.6 million, and by 1993, it was up to $1.3 billion. They had bought so many competitors that they were now the fourth largest long-distance provider in the US. And I know that sounded like an incredible growth rate already, but from this point, it started getting ridiculous. In 1994, they acquired IDB Communications Group for $936 million, which was a means of entering the international market. In 1995, they acquired Wiltel for $2.5 billion. In 1996, they acquired MFS Communications for $12.4 billion. That's how they entered the industry of local telephone service, and they just accelerated their growth from there. All in 1998, they acquired Brooks Fiber Properties for $2 billion, ANS Communications for $1.4 billion, and the big one was MCI. They bought them in a deal valued at $40 billion, which is an insane deal because MCI was actually a significantly larger company. The year before, their revenues were just under $20 billion, where WorldCom reported $7.4 billion. And by the way, make a note of that. Even before that insane MCI acquisition, their revenue was almost 5 times higher than it was 4 years earlier. There were a couple other notable ones, but the one that I want to mention is Sprint. In 1999, they announced that they would merge with them in a $115 billion deal. This deal never happened. The Department of Justice put a stop to it in fear that the resulting company would be too big and powerful, but they came close. As far as we know, all their accounting and everything they did before 1999 was on the up and up. This was when their crimes started. Let me tell you their motivation to lie about their earnings. It was the stock price. The stock market is understandably very concerned with the company's earnings. They release them 4 times a year, and each time everyone's waiting to see if they came in above or below expectations. If they're below, it is not good for the stock price. And obviously, any company wants to raise this price, but WorldCom had additional motivations. First off, all these acquisitions, many of them were made possible through that strong stock price. Simply put, it was something valuable they owned that was attractive to other companies. For example, that crazy MCI acquisition, WorldCom's strong value on the market made it possible to acquire a company even larger than they were. Of that $40 billion, only $7 billion of it was paid in cash. For the rest of it, they handed over 1.13 billion shares of WorldCom stock. If they wanted to continue growing through these acquisitions, which is obviously what they wanted to do, they needed to keep that stock price up. And to keep that stock price up, they needed to keep their earnings up. Starting in 1999, they were having trouble with all of it. A possible factor as to why they were struggling is the denial of that merger with Sprint. Part of the reason the stock was so attractive was how fast the company was growing, but now they were being stopped. Investors questioned how long they can keep growing in this way. It looked like it was coming to an end, and it sort of was. So now, WorldCom was forced forced to find other ways to provide value to the shareholders. Also, consider the entire industry was going through some tough times. AT&T, Sprint, it wasn't the best year for any of them. The competitive landscape was changing, the economy was going down, and the dot-com bubble was bursting, meaning there was less demand for these services. The important part to take away here is WorldCom needed their earnings to stay high, and because of various factors, they were having trouble doing it. Remember, revenue minus expenses equals earnings, so the two ways to raise earnings would be to either raise revenue or lower expenses, which is the two things that they were doing. I mean, they weren't doing it, but they were making a few accounting adjustments to make it appear that they were doing it. At first, it was just the revenue. It wasn't quite as high as they needed it to be, so they just lied and said that they were making more money. I thought this was interesting. The SEC found some handwritten notes calculating the difference between their actual revenue and their desired revenue, along with some journal entries that would be necessary to cover that difference. Those entries that were jotted down were then actually made after the quarter had ended to falsely make things look better than they actually were. The other big part of it was reduction of expenses, which was done by capitalizing things that they shouldn't have, a very common way of committing fraud. Here's what happened. Their largest single expense was something called line costs. They're a long distance provider, so they make the connection between local exchanges. Part of the cost of doing that is paying those local networks for the right to access their exchange. If I want to make a call from Los Angeles to New York, WorldCom will connect between the two cities, but have to pay each city in order to do it. It's obviously an expense, something that should be legally subtracted from their revenue and reduce their earnings. Well, they weren't doing that. They were treating it as an asset. Assets aren't expensed like that. They're expensed over time through depreciation. So instead of expensing these costs in the year they happen, like they should, they criminally elected to expense them over many years, resulting in a lower expense in each year. Initially, it was learned that they were doing this to $3.8 billion in line costs, and soon after, an additional $3.3 billion was revealed, putting the fraud well over $7 billion in total. They used a few other tricks too, but this was by far their biggest one. Here's what the SEC put together in 2003 to show the extent of this fraud. It shows that in a little more than 3 years, they reported over $9 billion in fraudulent earnings, and that estimate has since been increased to $11 billion. Those are figures that investors believed, and many of them used as a main tool in deciding to invest in their stock. I want to talk about this guy for a minute, Bernie Ebbers. He was the CEO during all this, and is generally the one thought to be most responsible. Bernie Ebbers had even further motivation to keep that stock price up because he personally owned a bunch of it. Some of it was on margin, and when that price went down, WorldCom actually loaned him $400 million to meet the margin call. I know that gets tricky, but just know there's a lot of levels of fraud here. For all these reasons, Bernie Ebbers, along with the CFO, Scott Sullivan, ordered the accounting team to make all of these illegal adjustments. Of course, there was no documentation to back up any of it, so those accountants must have known what was going on, but still went along with it because they were afraid that they would lose their jobs if they didn't. In 2002, the entire thing was exposed. It was becoming obvious. The whole Enron thing was exposed just months before, and WorldCom was magically doing much better than the rest of their industry. Their internal audit team got together with a new external auditor and started looking into everything, and just instantly saw that something was wrong. They reported what they found to the public and to the SEC. That's when everything started unraveling, and the bankruptcy proceedings started soon after. WorldCom did make it through the bankruptcy, after which they started going by the name MCI. In early 2006, they were bought by Verizon for over $8 billion. The CEO, Bernie Ebbers, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The CFO, Scott Sullivan, testified against Ebbers, so he was only sentenced to 5 years. In 2009, he was released after only serving 4, and there were other convictions as well. Now, as far as the people that were tricked into buying these securities, there was a class action lawsuit against a bunch of banks, including Citigroup and JP Morgan, that ended in a $6 billion settlement, most of which went to the bondholders. The SEC issued a civil penalty for $2.25 billion and a settlement with the new MCI where they paid the shareholders and bondholders a combined $750 million in cash and stock. Arthur Andersen, their accounting firm during these years, who, let's face it, should have picked up on some of this, agreed to a $65 million settlement with the investors. By the way, no one admitted any fault in any of these settlements. So that's how it ended. WorldCom joined Enron and a few other major accounting scandals at the time that led to a bunch of stricter accounting rules designed to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. Let me know in the comments, did you know about WorldCom? The company itself was around since 1983, but they didn't go by that name and weren't very well known anyway until the mid-90s. And considering they were gone by 2002, renamed MCI, and were much different overall, you may have missed them. It's sad to say that their legacy will be this accounting scandal. They use fraudulent accounting to exaggerate their revenue and reduce their expenses, resulting in falsely high earnings and stock price. At their peak, the total value of all these shares was $175 billion. They scam people out of billions of dollars by telling them what they wanted to hear to get their money. It's just kind of ironic to me. The word is earnings, the money they earned, and since they didn't earn it, you see what I mean? Also, there's other major accounting scandals out there, specifically some pretty big ones around this time, so let me know if you want me to talk about some of those. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.